The tunnels of the abandoned mining colony were silent except for the distant groan of metal under pressure, and Jaron, a human mechanic known for his stubborn curiosity, walked deeper with his lantern shaking in his hand, thus falling like ash from the cracked ceilings above. He had come searching for spare parts, but what he found froze him in his tracks, a collapsed chamber where the rubble glowed faintly, with an otherworldly shimmer, and at the center lay a woman unlike any he had ever seen, her skin faintly luminous and her breathing ragged, as if each breath cost her more than the last. Jaron felt his heart pound as she raised weak arms, clutching a bundle of torn silver cloth, and when the cloth slipped open, he saw the face of an infant with markings that pulsed gently like tiny stars. The alien mother's eyes deep pools of fading light locked onto his, and her cracked lips moved, whispering through the translator clipped to his belt, "Please, protect my baby." His mind spun. He was no soldier, no rescuer, just a mechanic who repaired ships and patched broken engines. Yet here he was, holding the weight of a life he could not understand. The ground shook violently, a reminder that the old mine was minutes away from burying them both in stone. But Jaron couldn't move at first, caught between fear and awe as the woman reached out once more, her trembling hands brushing the infant's cheek before falling lifeless against the rubble. Panic surged in his chest. She was gone, leaving him alone with a child that didn't belong to his world, in a place that was about to collapse. The baby gave a soft cry, thin and haunting, pulling Jaron out of his daze, and instinct finally seized him. Clutching the infant close, he scrambled back through the dark passageways, the tunnel roaring as rocks crashed down behind him and sparks of light flickered, where old energy lines snapped apart. Dust choked his lungs and sharp stones scraped his arms, but he kept moving, driven by the fragile weight pressed against his chest, a weight that now felt like more than just survival. It felt like a promise. As he reached the surface and staggered into the cold night air, the mine collapsed completely behind him, sending a shudder across the ground that made the baby wail louder. Jaron fell to his knees, gasping for breath, staring at the silent stars above. He had expected another night of scavenging, of oil and rust and forgotten machines, but instead he had walked into a dying mother's last wish, a plea that now rested entirely in his hands. Fear mixed with determination as he wrapped the child tighter in its cloth, the glowing markings faint but steady, like a quiet heartbeat of light. He knew nothing about alien royalty, prophecies, or galactic wars, yet in that moment he understood one thing with absolute certainty. He could not abandon the child, no matter what danger followed. The night wind whispered through the empty colony as Jaron rose unsteadily to his feet, the baby's small cries echoing against the ruins, and for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of a destiny larger than himself pressing down on his shoulders. Jaron carried the infant back to his workshop at the edge of the colony, his hands still trembling from the chaos of the mine collapse. And as he closed the heavy steel doors behind him, he finally allowed himself to breathe, though his heart still raced as if the shadows outside were watching. He laid the baby gently on his workbench, brushing away dust and oil stains with a rag, and for the first time in the dim glow of his lamps, he studied the child more closely. The silver cloth was worn and frayed, but the markings on the baby's skin pulsed faintly with a rhythm that almost matched the beat of his own heart. And every time the infant blinked, tiny sparks of blue light shimmered in its eyes. Jaron had fixed engines that sparked, reactors that hummed, and starships that roared. But nothing he had ever touched felt as alive or as fragile as this small being. And the weight of the alien mother's last words pressed on him like a stone he could not put down. He stumbled around his shop, searching for anything that might help hold nutrient packs, half-empty bottles of purified water, scraps of cloth he could turn into blankets. But the more he prepared, the more his mind spun with questions he could not answer. Why had she chosen him, a mechanic with grease under his nails and no training in raising a child? Who was hunting her, and why did they want the baby? He had no answers, but as the infant gave a soft, almost trusting coo when he fed it a few drops of water from his flask, he felt an unfamiliar spark inside him. A sense of purpose that both scared and steadied him at the same time. Outside, the colony was restless. Whispers spread quickly in places where life was hard and secrets were rare. And Jaren soon overheard traders muttering about a glowing child carried out of the mines, stories twisting into wild rumors about forbidden experiments and hidden treasure. The words tightened around him like a noose, because he knew once curiosity turned into fear or greed, someone would come searching, and once they did, they would not stop. That night, long after the baby had fallen asleep in a cradle he built from spare parts, Jaren sat by the window with his plasma torch resting on his lap like a weapon, listening to the wind howl through the broken streets. And though his body begged for sleep, his mind stayed sharp, tracing every sound, every shadow. He thought about leaving, running away from the colony with the infant before the rumors grew too strong. But the thought of stepping beyond the safe walls into the wild wastelands filled him with dread, because out there the dangers were greater than any human greed storms that swallowed ships, raiders who hunted travelers, and ancient machines buried in the dust. Yet as he watched the baby's faint glow pulse in the dark, a glow that seemed to fight back the emptiness of the night, Jaren realized that the choice had already been made, not by him but by the alien mother whose dying eyes had locked onto his. And he whispered into the silence, "I promised you, and I won't break it." Still, he could not ignore the truth pressing at the edge of his thoughts. Someone was coming, someone who knew the value of what now lay asleep under his roof, and when they arrived, he would no longer be able to hide in the shadows of his small workshop. The attack came sooner than Jaren expected, just as the colony lights flickered into their nightly dim cycle, and he had only moments to react when the heavy steel doors of his workshop rattled, under the force of strangers trying to break in, their shadows stretching long and jagged against the cracks of light. He grabbed the infant from its makeshift cradle, the soft glow of its markings pulsing faster as if sensing the danger, and pressed it close against his chest while his mind raced through every tool, every trick, every escape route he had ever built into his shop. The pounding on the door grew louder, then sharper, as plasma cutters hissed against the metal, and sparks showered the floor in bursts of red-orange fire, filling the air with the acrid smell of burning steel. Jaren's hands trembled as he tore open a hatch in the back wall, one he had once built for smuggling spare ship parts, and with the baby cradled in one arm, he crawled into the narrow passage just as the main door gave way and armed figures stormed inside. From the darkness of the crawl space, he heard their boots hammering against the floor, voices muffled by masks, but clear enough to carry a single word over and over the child. His lungs burned as he dragged himself forward, thus filling his throat, the baby whimpering softly. But he pressed on until the tunnel spat him out into the open night, where the cold air hit him like a slap, and the desert winds howled across the abandoned outskirts of the colony. He ran without looking back, his boots kicking up clouds of sand as the infant's glow lit the path in front of him. And behind him he could already hear the shouts and the engines roaring to life, hunters spilling into the night with speed and numbers he could not hope to match. His only chance was the wasteland, a place he had sworn never to cross, because no one who entered without a convoy ever returned. But tonight he had no choice, and as lightning danced silently across the horizon, he sprinted toward the jagged cliffs that marked the border between civilization and the endless wilds. The ground shook beneath his feet as raider bikes tore after him, beams of light cutting through the dark, and Jaren ducked into a canyon path he barely remembered from years ago, weaving through sharp rocks that ripped his arms and slowed his pace, yet he kept moving, driven by a desperate instinct that told him stopping meant losing more than his own life. Just when his strength began to fail, a blast of searing light shot past him, striking the canyon wall and showering him with shards of stone. And in that moment of terror, the infant's markings flared like a burst of stars, forming a shimmering shield around them that deflected the next strike and left the pursuers shouting in alarm. Jaren's breath caught, his heart hammering as he realized the baby was not defenseless, but whatever force protected them had left the child limp and exhausted in his arms, its glow dimming again as if drained by the effort. Gritting his teeth, Jaren pushed forward, ducking through a narrow fissure that his larger pursuers could not follow. And when he finally stumbled into a hidden ravine lit faintly by the stars above, he collapsed to his knees, clutching the child against his chest, sweat pouring down his face. The night was silent again, except for the faint hum of distant engines searching for him. And he knew the hunt would not end here. They would keep coming. Faster and stronger, because this baby was not just a secret. It was something far greater, something worth killing for. With trembling resolve, Jaren whispered into the quiet, "I won't let them take you." And though he was only a mechanic lost in a wasteland, the words felt heavier than any oath he had ever spoken, binding him to a fight he had never imagined he would face. Jaren woke at dawn to the harsh light spilling across the ravine, his body aching from the frantic escape, and for a moment he thought it had all been a nightmare until he looked down at the sleeping infant in his arms, its faint glow returning slowly with each steady breath, reminding him that this fragile being was now his entire purpose. He knew he could not stay hidden in the canyon forever, because sooner or later the hunters would sweep every rock and shadow, so he began moving again, his boots crunching against the dry earth as he carried the child deeper into the wastelands. Guided by old stories he had once overheard from traders about an abandoned orbital station, hidden in the mountains, a place where refugees sometimes found shelter if they were desperate enough to survive the journey. The trek was brutal. Storms of dust rose without warning, cutting off his sight and stinging his skin. Jagged cliffs forced him to climb with one hand while clutching the child with the other, and hunger gnawed at his stomach as his supplies ran thin. But every time he faltered, he remembered the dying mother's last look and pushed on, each step heavy but determined. By the third night, when exhaustion threatened to crush him completely, he stumbled upon a hidden cave that opened into a chamber, carved with strange symbols glowing faintly on the walls. And there, sitting among old machines covered in dust, was a frail alien scholar whose eyes widened at the sight of the infant. The scholar, his voice cracked with age yet steady with wisdom, asked how Jaren had come to carry the child, and after hearing the story, he grew grave and whispered truths that made Jaren's blood run cold. The baby was no ordinary life, but the last descendant of a fallen royal bloodline, a lineage once meant to unite worlds, destroyed by betrayal and war. And those who hunted now sought to twist that power into a weapon of domination. Jaren felt the weight of the revelation press on him like a mountain, because he was no warrior, no leader, just a mechanic who patched broken machines. Yet here he was being told that the fragile child in his arms was destined to change the fate of entire civilizations. The scholar warned him that choices made in the coming days would decide whether the child grew to heal the galaxy or became a tool for conquest. And though fear clawed at Jaren's chest, a spark of defiance flared within him, because he remembered how the infant's glow had shielded them from certain death, not with destruction, but with protection, as if the child itself rejected cruelty. Before he could ask more, the walls trembled with the distant echo of engines, hunters drawing near, and the scholar urged Jaren to take the child and flee to the orbital station, where hidden allies might help, pressing into his hands a small device marked with the same symbols as the child's skin, whispering that it would guide him when the time came. With no time to waste, Jaren strapped the device to his belt, lifted the infant close once more, and ran from the cave as shadows spread across the sky, knowing that every step forward bound him tighter to a destiny he had never chosen, but could no longer deny. The orbital station hung like a broken lantern above the wastelands, its outer rings cracked and silent. Yet when Jaren approached in an old transport shuttle he had scavenged from a forgotten outpost, he felt the weight of danger pressing down on him. For the hunters were closing in fast, and there was no time left to hide. He carried the infant close, the tiny glow of its markings a fragile light against the dark corridors. As he forced open the airlock and stepped into the hollow shell of the station, his ears filled with the echo of every footstep, every groan of shifting metal, every whisper of a place long abandoned. The station's control hub became his fortress, and though it was filled with dead consoles and rusted panels, Jaren's hands moved with instinct born from years of repairing broken machines. He rerouted power from one sector to another, rigged engines into makeshift traps, turned welding beams into mounted weapons, and sealed doors with reinforced plating. He knew he could not outgun the hunters who were descending from the sky, but he could outthink them, and as the infant lay swaddled in a cradle made from a flight seat, Jaren whispered a quiet promise that he would fight with everything he had. Soon the silence shattered with the thunder of docking clamps and the hiss of pressurized air, and shadows poured into the station figures armed and merciless, their voices sharp as they shouted orders, their search driven by greed and hunger for the child's power. Jaren waited in the dark, his hand on the switch he had wired to a line of explosive fuel cells, and when the first squad stepped through the corridor, he triggered the trap, sending a blast of fire that lit the station with violent light and scattered his enemies in panic. The battle that followed was chaos. Plasma bolts cut through walls, sparks rained from ruptured wires, and the hunters pressed harder with every wave, yet Jaren used every corner, every hatch, every machine as a weapon, drawing them into traps, striking with the precision of a man who had lived his whole life fixing the broken, and now turned that skill toward survival. Still, the numbers grew, and exhaustion clawed at him as the attackers closed in on the hub, until at last one of them broke through the barricade and aimed a burning rifle at the cradle. Jaren's heart stopped, but before he could move, the infant's markings erupted in a burst of radiant energy, forming a shield of shimmering light that deflected the shot and threw the attacker across the room. The station itself trembled as if awakened, panels flickering alive, old machines humming with a power they had long forgotten, and for the first time the hunters faltered, fear replacing certainty in their movements. Jaren seized the moment, using the last of his strength to drive them back, sealing the docking bays and flooding the outer corridors with vacuum, leaving only silence behind. His chest heaved with exhaustion as he fell beside the cradle, the infant's glow now soft again, fragile and calm, as though the storm had passed for a moment. Jaren knew this victory was only a pause in a larger war, but as he looked at the child's peaceful face, he felt a fire within him that no fear could extinguish, for he had stood against impossible odds and endured, proving that even a mechanic armed with nothing but courage and ingenuity could defy the weight of destiny. The orbital station drifted in silence after the battle, its halls scorched and broken, yet alive with faint pulses of power that Jaren could not explain, as if the child's outburst had awakened something long buried in its steel bones. And as he walked through the dim corridors carrying the infant close, he felt both relief and dread pressing against his chest, for though the hunters were gone, he knew they would return with greater force. He stood at the viewport of the hub, staring at the endless stretch of stars, wondering how a simple mechanic had been bound to a destiny he had never chosen. And as the infant stirred in his arms, its small hand gripping the edge of his sleeve, he thought again of the alien mother's dying eyes, the silent plea she had left in his care, a plea he had carried through storms, raids, and fire. The device the old scholar had given him began to glow faintly at his belt, its symbols shifting as if alive, and when Jaren touched it, the station's dormant systems responded, holographic maps flickering across the cracked walls, revealing routes that led beyond the colony, beyond the hunting grounds, into regions marked with stars he had never known. Among the projections was a symbol that matched the infant's glowing markings, a destination that seemed less like a place and more like a promise. And Jaren understood that the journey was only beginning, that this station had become a stepping stone toward something far greater. Yet even as he prepared for what lay ahead, the weight of danger lingered, for transmissions began to echo through the calm system's distorted voices calling for his surrender, warnings that fleets were gathering, and offers of wealth and safety if he gave up the child. Jaren's fists tightened, his jaw set, and though fear gnawed at him, he whispered to the infant that he would never give in, not after all they had endured, not after all the sacrifices made. He spent the following days repairing the station's engines with the few resources left, his body bruised and weary but his hands steady, building not for himself but for the life that trusted him without words. And at night he would sit by the cradle, watching the child's glow fill the darkness with gentle light, reminding him that hope was still alive even in the ruins of war. When the engines finally roared back to life, trembling through the vast emptiness, Jaren strapped into the pilot's seat with the infant secured beside him, and with one last look at the shattered colony below, he launched into the unknown, leaving behind the ashes of what had been and carrying forward the fragile spark of what could be. As the stars stretched into lines and the ship leapt into faster-than-light travel, Jaren whispered a vow into the void that no hunter, no empire, no shadow could silence, that he would raise the child not as a weapon, but as a beacon, and that the galaxy would one day know the truth of a dying mother's sacrifice and the mechanic who kept her legacy alive.